My mother's parents lost almost all their family in the Shoah. Her grandfather was a famous German composer, Heinz Levine, whose family had been German patriots in the First World War. One of the most shocking aspects of the Shoah for me is how quickly people were able to become desensitized to the injustice that they were inflicting and witnessing, how civilized people could rationalize their actions or their standing by. It is important to teach the Shoah so that we can properly appreciate how easily civilization can crumble into brutality and barbarism. We learn to be sensitive and safeguard other lives and to be wary of our own fickle judgments.
As a child, my great-grandma had to flee Germany on the last ever Kindertransport to England.
My maternal grandparents' families were murdered by the Nazis.
Hello, my dad was born in the occupied Netherlands in 1941, in the middle of the war. He was delivered by a Jewish doctor because non-Jewish doctors would not deliver Jewish people.
Of my great-grandpa's 9 siblings, 7 were exterminated in the concentration camps.
One of my great-grandparents was one of the only 2 who survived from his town. He escaped to England on the Kindertransport at only 15.
My grandma, when she was much younger, her mum was very ill, so she was sent to an orphanage for a bit of time. But the orphanage was bombed. Luckily, she was rescued from the rubble, along with many other kids, by firemen.
My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother were both in Auschwitz, and luckily they managed to survive. However, my great-grandfather's first family were all killed in Auschwitz.
Great-great-auntie got taken to a concentration camp during the Holocaust.
My grandma and her family were victims of the Holocaust. They were taken care of for 6 weeks by Righteous Among the Nations in a school, and later were taken to the Bochnia ghetto. And following that, they went to a concentration camp in Germany called Bergen-Belsen. And she was there with her cousin Yakov and her mother. And the 3 of them survived the war and were able to meet up afterwards with her father, who'd been fighting in the Polish army.
Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to my mum's side of the family because they were separated in the Holocaust, and we have no records of where they were killed, when they were killed. But luckily, my mum's great uncle managed to escape, and he moved to England. Also, my grandpa's parents managed to escape, and they moved to Israel.
My great-grandfather was sent to Auschwitz, along with his wife and 2 children. Unfortunately, he was the only one that survived, and after World War II had to rebuild his family.
Both my grandpas were from Germany, so obviously they were greatly affected by the Holocaust. Being German Jews, they both had to flee the country and leave everything they had behind.
Most of my entire family was affected by the Holocaust. Many died in concentration camps. However, some survived. For example, my grandfather, who was tipped off about 2 hours before Nazis were due to come to his house to deport him.
My mother came here in 1939. Her parents couldn't get out, and they remained in Berlin until about 1942, when they were deported to a detention camp in eastern Poland, where I understand they escaped, but got as far as the Marszałkowska Street in Warsaw, and they were captured there and shot dead by firing squad, as far as I understand it.
Really the sheer numbers of it.
The sheer number of people who died.
Behind each of the 6 million is a life, a story. It's truly staggering.
Just look at the Jewish deaths, because that's closest to my heart as a Jew myself. That's 6 million people, and I just think that statistic of 6 million people isn't taken seriously enough. It's just seen as a number.
The knowledge that my great-uncle didn't live beyond the age of 6.
When I heard my grandma telling me how her mother, my great-grandmother, had bought a bottle of cyanide so they could commit suicide rather than suffer under the hands of the Nazis.
Learning about the Parno massacre, about 100,000 people, they were dragged down a forest, blindfolded, and then they were forced to dig graves, which they eventually were buried in themselves.
Probably that no one did anything about it, that people kind of let it happen and just turned a blind eye.
The fact that Hitler built factories just to kill people.
Those deported to concentration camps were gassed, starved, and worked to death under forced labour.
Even now, more than 75 years later, there are still details that are emerging from what happened in the war.
The word Holocaust comes from the Greek word holokausten, which means sacrificial burning, and this is because after the mass killing, the dead were burned at the crematorium or in an open fire.
The stories of people who survived, the bravery of those who did survive and how they did it is one of the most amazing things.
Over 2/3 of all Jews living in Europe at the time were murdered at the hands of the Nazi regime.
The fact that the Nazis just chose to keep all of the belongings and the hair and the clothing and everything that belonged to the Jews when they went to the camps.
When I went to Auschwitz, I saw the room full of hair that had been taken off of people who were about to be gassed.
There are other concentration camps I'd never heard of before because we're mainly taught about Auschwitz and how shockingly high the number of deaths were in those camps.
You know, people went to work in the morning as an SS officer and people woke up in the morning as prisoners in Auschwitz, and they weren't history. They weren't names in textbooks. They were people.
Because it teaches us about the importance of respecting the culture of minority groups.
Not because the Holocaust was the first or the last genocide in human history, but precisely because it's not.
I think it's so important to teach people in society not to hate.
Whilst there are a few Holocaust survivors left, to hear their stories so that we can pass it on to the future generations who will eventually be the world leaders, as to not let something like this happen again.
Appreciating man's extremes, man's abilities for greatness, a man's abilities for evil.
You're working in Holocaust and Genocide commemoration. I've been blessed to meet so many survivors. It's their passion and their dedication that inspires me to keep going and make sure we learn the lessons from the Holocaust and genocide.
Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's important to learn because I feel in a certain way that can unite us in our understanding.
History shows that it has repeated itself multiple times.
It is our duty to make sure that their stories are passed on.
It shows us what we are capable of when societies allow prejudice to be commonplace.
The fact that there are still many Holocaust deniers, we just need to keep remembering and keep educating.
Because it helps people learn to recognise the patterns that can lead up to an atrocity such as this one and take steps to ensure that it won't happen again.
So much of today's anti-Semitism is rooted in the Holocaust, and unless if we educate people, such anti-Semitism which is so recurrent today will never come to an end.
Once it's over and done, all we have left is the lessons that we can learn from it.
So a lot of people that make jokes about it and deny it and don't even know what happened, and I think that really needs to change.
We need to learn how we can no longer just sit by and act as bystanders, not taking notice of the injustices in the world around us.
It shows on a broad scale what discrimination can lead to.
To ensure that something like this never happens again.
It tells you so much about the dangers of racism, the dangers of blindly following an ideology.
Only a minority of Holocaust survivors are still alive to tell their story. It's my responsibility as a Jewish person to tell the world the horrors that they live through.
It gives meaning to some of the atrocity and suffering which people had to experience.
And it also allows people to understand what others have gone through to try and help them.
Spread the message of never again.
So that we can make sure that the phrase never again is actually implemented.
We can ensure through the power of education that nothing like this ever happens again.
Without it, we will end up repeating the mistakes of the past.